Quin's mother was a beautiful whore. Mardine Prince, the tarnished jewel of Lexington. Her bed was the fellow to bards and politicians alike. Brothels, stables, the local market. There was no space too sacred or respectable not to find itself warmed and wetted beneath her naked rump and parted knees. If you had a dime, then you had her attention. Her thighs were home to the loneliest of gents and ladies. And as these stories often go, it was within the fog of one of those lustful nights that her precious Quin came into conception. Quin was a tiny boy that was born far too early. He was thin, pale, and dreadfully wrinkled when he emerged from his mother. Sin had carved him from her womb. And it would seem that all his days he would be marred by that label. The product of sin. All in all, he grew to be strong and healthy in bone and heart. But his lungs were another matter entirely. Every leaf drew a sneeze and every animal inspired a wheeze. That meant that the young Mr. Quin spent the days of his youth indoors and as a spectator. Through his window, he watched children at play. He imagined himself involved in their conversations. But in truth, there would be no socializing for dear Quin. Nature had defied him by poisoning her beautiful flowers with pollen. And his mother's reputation scarred him so masterfully that even her suitors upturned their noses to the boy when he found himself bold enough to attempt conversation or play with them. One can only stand to be a social pariah for so long before one begins to embrace it. And so, the young sir drew his curtains shut and watched the children at play no more. He filled his days with jigsaw puzzles, cheap paints that he made the most of, and novels. Oh, how he loved his novels. And his nights, well, those were another matter. Mother had to maintain her duties after all. And that meant entertaining guests well into the night. To bear her duties, he smothered out their pounding moans and echoing groans beneath a feathered pillow. One that he pressed tight against his ear as he curled toward the window. Some nights there was a single star that's light was dazzling enough to peek through the small tatters in his drapes. That star became his only friend. She was endlessly kind to him on the nights when the old down in his pillow caused him to sneeze violently. And those fits were unkind to his mother's company. So she beat him, mercilessly, when they left without payment on account of her child's allergenic misgivings. Quin, I have to feed us somehow. Do you want us to starve? I tell you, go to your room and be quiet. They won't come and enjoy themselves if they know my boy is peeping next door. After mother had tired of yelling and thrashing him about, she'd take his lamp and slam his door. But this was nothing new to Quin. He'd limp if he could bear to stand, and if standing were too painful then he'd make his way on the ground toward his window. It sat just high enough off of the ground for him to lay an arm across its pane and rest his chin there. His swollen eyes would lift themselves and search the sky for a bit of comfort from his friend. And when she was not there, he wept solemnly. Cloudy nights were the loneliest. The young Mr. Quin was used to life being the same as he. A disappointment. But he took his beatings, and he loved his mother. What else was a boy to do? He had no choice but to become a quick study of life's lessons. Don't sneeze lest you be beaten. So he plugged his nose with cotton or covered his face with a rag. Don't lift your eyes in the streets lest you be mocked. So he watched his boots when he walked. Don't think yourself equal to decent folk. So he dared not speak, lest first spoken to. Quin learned to swallow his coughs and stifle his sneezes. In fact, he concealed his discomfort so thoroughly that eventually, he appeared to be the picture of health. That is, if no one paid attention to the constant gloss of irritation over his eyes or the persistent puffy bags that cradled them in spring and fall. Even still, Quin grew to be quite a handsome young man. He was taller than most. So tall, in fact, that when he traveled the streets, eyes on boots, he often found himself looking down at others, rather than avoiding eye contact with them. How strange it was, that the very people looking down upon him had to crane their necks upward, in order to do so properly. But when their eyes did find him, they would often find themselves struck with awe. His eyes were magnificent sapphires, marbled with the bluest of blue. They were seeping with the mystique of starlight. An ocean of indigo that could only come from long nights spent bathing beneath the moon. Eyes so piercing that one might mistake them for having their own radiant glow. A gift from his friend, no doubt. Isolation left his skin as pale and as white as a noble woman's blushing powder. What women paid for, he carried naturally. But unlike them, work had not been gentle upon the young man's flesh. His hands were calloused and thick. His knees were bruised and his back was sore. There was hardly an inch of flesh upon Quinn that had not seen scrape or scar. But there was no time to mourn over blistered hands. Mother was ill-spent and Quinn was now a working man. One might find him in the market tearing down goat meat for pennies. Or knee-deep in pig shat, prodding it about into slumping piles that would later be mushed with gravel and churned into the most pungent fertilizer. In the winter he might be found huddled atop a roof to sweep the chimneys of the wealth below. It was strange that he always seemed to find himself placed above the very people that deemed him to be beneath them. But Quinn dared not to think so highly of himself. At times he'd catch a glimpse of a family through their window. Settled on the roof, he'd watch them cuddle next to a fire. The mothers reading to their children drew special attention from him, as did the lovers waltzing about. It all seemed so foreign, and yet, so lovely. Everything through those windows seemed to be bathed in a blanket of warmth and affluence. One that Quinn would never know. But it could not be helped that in his moments of weakness, he'd imagine himself in the window with them, laughing and socializing and experiencing love. It was in those very moments that reality always seemed to shake him back into place. Most often with a well-timed gust of chilled winter air, or a patron wagging a fist below and barking up at him to hurry things along. And so he would throw his eyes to the love of his youth. And she would smile upon him with her dazzling rays. And all would be well with the dutiful young Mr. Quinn, as he continued his work. Now, one might not possess the wherewithal to discern whether it was his swan-like features or his dutiful charm that left girls blushing to their mother's dismay, but they did, and they did in plenty. Most notably, they marveled at the length of his pristinely blonde hair, as no respectable gent would go so long without a trim. Seeing such length of hair on a man was as equally perplexing as it was mesmerizing to the young ladies. Quinn was none the wiser. He never stopped to chat with women or busy himself in their gossip. And thus the girls developed theories that he must be devilishly dark and quite mysterious. They wove a plethora of other traits and projected them upon him. Such storytelling only made them that much more curious to know him. A knowing that would never occur under the tactful noses of their probing mothers. As soon as they caught a whiff of their daughters swooning, they shamed the girls even more thoroughly for fawning after the son of a whore. The attention of girls meant little to Quinn, so their being whisked away by their mothers wasn't a painful thing. Well, maybe a little, but not nearly as painful as cloudy nights. Quinn too could not escape the skirts of a forward mother. She dragged him about from one city to the next, always in hope of a new beginning. One that never came. And as stories go, that is how he ended up here, in our fair city of Bridgerton. Dearest mother had come here on a promise. A promise of dark sorts. The misgivings of her youth had worn her beauty into the dirt. Her health was now dwindling away behind ragged coughs and bloody hacks. She was turned into a withered old bag with nothing but misery to share. And oh, how she intended to share that misery. Rumors were already spreading. Could it be possible that a Lexington whore sired the son of the great and powerful? You notice that the edges of this paper are swollen and rippled as if it narrowly survived being wet. The rest of the text is lost behind smears of ink and indiscernible characters. It would seem that you'll have to travel to Bridgerton and happen upon the young Mr. Quinn yourself, if you wish to know how his story ends.